I'm Amanda Knox, and you're listening to Hard Knocks. Today on Hard Knocks, I interview Helen Lewis, who is a journalist, broadcaster, and author of The Genius Myth, The Dangerous Allure of Rebels, Monsters, and Rule Breakers. Her new book about why we worship geniuses, or so-called geniuses, and how that myth blinds us to the damage they often cause. She shows how brilliance is rarely a solo act, how it can come at a steep human cost, and why we need more honest stories about creativity and achievement. This is a really fun conversation. For all my Taylor Swifties out there, we have a discussion about Taylor Swift quite a bit. We talk about how we can have honest, but how we can shift the myth from the lone genius to a person who cultivates a team of excellence around them. How this idea of and this destructive idea of a lone genius who then, burns his legacy of people around him, how that is reflected also when we are experiencing the lows of our life and become hyper-fixated and narcissistic in our own hurt kind of way, and how destructive that is. So a lot of really interesting parallels and conversations about making sense of the world and how we define success. So enjoy.
I really love the piece you did for us at The Atlantic about the guy who was convicted that you campaigned for and then changing your mind on him. I thought that was really brave and beautifully done. So I was very delighted to get this invitation.
Oh, wonderful. Well, I'm so glad that you read that, because that was a big that was a huge growing moment for me as a person, and I felt like we need growing moments like that.
Oh, no,
generally.
like saying, I've changed my mind about something in public is like the world's most thankless task, right? Because all the people who were previously on your side now hate you. And then all the people who thought the new way that you think say, well, where were you? Why didn't you to do this sooner? So you just think, well, that was absolutely thankless. Well done me for doing that.
Yeah. Although you'd be surprised, I was expecting to get a lot of negativity in response to that, but I had lots of people reach out very quietly to me to say, oh my God, thank you for doing that, because we've been afraid to say something for a long time. And so it's interesting how stuff like that comes to the forefront. So today we're going to talk about the genius myth. Thank you for coming on Hard Knocks, where I attempt to talk about, how we figure things out from the School of Hard Knocks. And I just wondered, because you've written quite a bit about, the history of feminism and the progression. And I'm sure you've asked this question a million times before, but what was it about genius that made you want to address that in your next writing project?
It's a very good question, and it's one that I wish I had a better answer to, because I just sort of thought it would be interesting. And then I started doing all the reading for it, and it's such an interesting topic, because it's something that has attracted so many people to write about it, even though it's essentially an ineffable quality, right? There's no actual definition. And in fact, people have gone mad in the search for a definition of genius. That's where the kind of IQ wars of the kind of beginning of the 20th century were all about. This idea that if there was a quality called G, general intelligence, and some people who had ultra high amounts of that were geniuses. And of course, it's nowhere near as simple as that. There's some very smart people, and they, become a maths professor at a university and live a very nice life, but no one ever hears a single word about them. And there are people who've got probably average intelligence, but they've got some other quality, enormous force of will, and they become politicians, for example, or creative ability, or whatever it might be. And everybody in the world knows their name. So I like that kind of quicksilver quality to it. And, you're right, it does fit a little bit with my first book on difficult women, which was about feminism, because I did think for a while about calling this book Great Men, because there is that gender aspect to it, right? The people who... So the right-wing way of looking at it is that men are more ambitious, men are maybe smarter, whatever it is, men are more driven. That's why we hear about more men. The left-wing way of looking at it is that men throughout history have had many more opportunities. But I also think there's something about hero worship and who do we want to hero worship? And I think it's, for a lot of people, it's easier to put a man on a pedestal still. There's a lot of nitpicking about any kind of, woman who gets, and I just don't know if women get idolized in that same way. And then, of course, there's this whole theory that comes from the Victorian essayist Thomas Carlyle, which is what's now called the great man theory of history, which is the idea that actually just every so often in an epoch, a man comes along and changes the world. And in some respects, I do have some sympathy with that, right? I don't have much sympathy with it in the domain of science, because actually if you look at the history of invention, one of the surprising things is how many people arrive at the same idea at the same time, that it's just sort of in the air waiting to happen. But in politics, I do, because I don't think you take Donald Trump out of the American equation and the last 15 years of American politics do look different, right? The same underlying trends might have been there, but they would not have crystallized in exactly the same way around him. He's that figure that has made things happen.
What about art? So, putting science aside, science is everyone who's on the shoulders of other scientists. Everyone's working together. No one's making a breakthrough necessarily just on their own. But in politics, we see these individual figures who do have individual personalities that make a huge difference. What about in the realm of art?
Well, art is so bound up with the idea of movements, and so much about recombining stuff. So, just to give you an example, my favorite artist I would probably say is Van Gogh. And what's the American way of saying that? How do you say it? It's Van Gogh,
Van
isn't it?
Gogh,
Van
yeah.
Gogh. But his great innovation was to take a kind of post-impressionist brushstroke, and then he loved Japanese wood block prints, these ukiyo-e prints. So that has got like the thick black line and then the structural composition of his scenes. And the thing that's fascinating is now people will probably get very tense about that and call it cultural appropriation. But the fact is that Japan loves it. And in fact, when Sunflowers back in the 90s made an auction record, it was bought by a Japanese bank because they loved this collision of Western and Eastern art styles. If you look at some of Picasso's work, early work in Cubism, he's taking stuff from African tribal masks. He's taking things from ancient Greek statuary. There's always an element of remix in all of this stuff. And so, I love to look at that because I think it really makes the story richer and deeper. Lots of people really revolt against it because they see it as a kind of debunking, dethroning process. It's like they feel that they're being told that they're not allowed to like people that they like. Because I'm coming along and saying Picasso was influenced by these people is the same as me saying Picasso wasn't a genius. You're stupid if you like him. And that's absolutely not the truth. It's just a fundamentally two competing ways of looking at society.
Okay. So do you think that the idea of a genius, of a lone genius, is a dangerous idea, an untruthful idea? What do you call that idea?
Yeah, the subtitle in America is a dangerous idea because it has, through history, been a really dangerous idea. So I mentioned intelligence earlier. You can't really tell the history of intelligence testing without eugenics, without the idea that, some people should simply be discarded from the gene pool because their scores are too low. And that, that used to be taught as something that this was a terrible ideology that became very prevalent in America in the 20s and 30s and obviously Nazi Germany. And it's now one that's really made a comeback. You will go on X any day of the week and you will find people arguing, that there are genius level IQs and then at the other end there are morons and imbeciles, and that we are living in a dysgenic society that is encouraging too many of the latter type of people. So that's the kind of stuff. And one of the things that's always really interesting about a book is you end up finding out all this stuff about yourself that you didn't know. So I was raised Catholic and I'm not Catholic anymore. But I realized that upbringing had given me that fundamental Christian teaching, which is of the innate dignity of the human person, right? It's one of the reasons that I really love the fact that, the Catholics, for example, have always been really, even in America, opposed to the death penalty. They're often very traditional in social terms, but they believe that only God can give and take life. And so lots of Catholics have a principled objection to the death penalty. And, and I think I now feel that about that. I feel there is an innate human worth of people that is not tied to whether or not they're a genius. And that actually this, we should celebrate achievement and aspiration and ambition and all that kind of stuff. But I don't like this idea of classes of people. And I certainly don't like them when they're drawn with these fake scientific precision of something like an IQ test, right? And that's the way that you will hear now a lot of people talking about IQ. And that's one of the ways I think, yeah, that genius can be a kind of slightly dangerous, reductive, dehumanizing idea.
Hmm. I just wrote an article for The Atlantic about evil and the idea of evil, which is kind of it's a I mean, one could say it's like it's not the same thing as like the opposite of genius because as your book conveys, there are a lot of people who are geniuses
A
who
lot of wrong uns,
do
yeah, who are
a lot
geniuses.
of do
Yeah.
of atrocious things. But this idea that like there's some innate quality that people has that makes them exceptional and in that case evil. And one of the things that I was trying to push back on is this idea of like categorizing people in such an extreme way. And instead trying to like one, because I think that as I think one of the takeaways that you try to convey in your book is that we should apply the term like genius to specific works and not people per se. And in the same way, I think that we should apply the term evil to actions and behaviors and not necessarily people. But also because I was pointing out that one, there's a lot that we do not understand about the human mind. Therefore, we can't like we sort of diagnose people with evil which is a way of saying we don't understand you, we don't understand how your brain works, and we typically do not appreciate their social and psychological context as they commit evil acts. And so I think that in a way we're exploring a similar idea but from different angles potentially, and I'm wondering if that resonates with you in any way in how you've tackled this idea of the genius.
I think it does because what you're talking about essentially is monstrosity and the fact that we want people to be monsters. If a crime has happened, we want it to be committed by a specific class of person that we can then guard ourselves against and like wall that person off from the rest of humanity. Like the way that if you look about the way that people talk about child abuse, the tropes that always come out are about the kind of stranger danger, the guy with the candy in the van. And unfortunately, we know that most child abuse is perpetrated within the family, right? It's dads, it's stepdads, it's brothers, predominantly. But, and the number of men who are arrested for child sexual, like having images of child sexual abuse is horrifically high, just an extraordinary. And yeah, maybe all of those people are secretly monsters, or maybe something more horrible is true, which is that there are people who are otherwise in their everyday life, the kind of guy who volunteers at the homeless shelter and does all these and is a perfect colleague, but has also got this really dark and horrible strand within him. And I think people find that really uncomfortable and they would prefer it. They would just prefer to wall off that category. And something similar happens with genius. And I think in the case of genius, maybe it's a bit about wanting to hero worship people. It's a bit about sometimes wanting to win a battle of ideas that you just put your kind of pawn on the chessboard. And if someone's a genius, then that advances the set of ideas that's behind them. And also, I talked to a friend a lot about this, about whether or not is the idea of genius a way of dealing with envy? Is it a way of dealing with the fact that it's really hard to try and fail? And lots of us don't want to do things and risk being humiliated. So maybe there's a protective shield that says, well, I can't do that because I'm not a genius. If I was a genius, then I would try and become a senator or like whatever it might be, write the great American novel. But I can't. So, I don't need to feel bad about these other people having stuff that I don't have because they're geniuses.
Right. That actually reminds me of something that Bo Burnham once said in an interview. Fan of I'm a fan of like hilarious, I love comedy and I love music, and
The
he's
only
such
good art to
a
come out of the pandemic,
genius.
right, is Bo Burnham's
Right.
Inside.
Yes, and some might argue that he's a genius for having like put together this thing. And in I think in the past he once was asked by someone like, "Oh, how can I accomplish what you've accomplished?" And he was like, "Well, you can't because so much of it is just luck." Like he was like, I just happened to be a lonely kid who was like had a piano, had a keyboard and a YouTube channel, and I just happened to be putting out videos at a time when people like there was no anticipating it, like someone just kind of it made me rise to the surface, but he didn't like attribute it to any kind of genius per se. It was very much a matter of luck, and he was like, you can try and try and try, but like the circumstances that led to me being successful versus someone else don't exist anymore. And so I can't tell you how to do the thing that I did, because it just was a matter of being in the right place at the right time, doing the right thing. And I wonder if you know, one of the things you talk about in this book is how so much of this genius myth doesn't like acknowledge how much of the world around the person and the people around the genius really elevate them. But I think there's also something true that, you know, or maybe there's not. Tell me, like, I know recently you wrote something, an article about Taylor Swift. Taylor Swift has risen, has been, has raised herself and has this huge following and this huge platform, and so many people would refer to her as a genius. And what do you think? How how are we wrong about our relationship with this person, and how are we right?
Well, Taylor, I could talk about Taylor Swift all day, but there's a couple
All
of things.
right.
So I think I'd be very happy to say she is possibly the greatest songwriter of her generation. Like the length of the career and the consistency of the quality. Okay, not every song on Lover is amazing, but you know what I mean. Like there have been dips, but as a body of work, it's really incredible. But I went to see the Eras tour last year, and my friend who I went with said, you know that her band, that they've been with her for years and years and years and years, and that's really important when you're playing stadium gigs, right? That you all know everything. There was quite a very sweet interview with Travis Kelce in GQ in which he talked about the fact that she's an athlete. She said she would never describe herself as an athlete, but she's out there performing on that stage. It's 40 degrees. Sorry, I can't translate it to America. It's 100 degrees, in Singapore or wherever it is that she's performing. The stage is lit up, and she practices to do those songs by running on a treadmill and singing the songs. And the other thing is that you can watch footage when she was 16 or even 20, and her voice is naturally not that great, right? Her pitch and her tone. She's really worked incredibly hard on breath control to become the singer that she is today. She's also been really smart about her collaborators. People like Jack Antonoff that she's worked with consistently. People like Max Martin, the kind of hit maker she's going to work with on the new album. So she has found the right people, both in the band, both to work with, all of that. Tree Payne, her publicist, has been with her for like a million years. She's obviously somebody who values competence and loyalty in the people around her. And also she's just obviously got an extremely formidable work ethic. And all of that, I think, I don't know about you, but I find that a more inspirational story than if this had just been a kind of divine bolt of lightning and she woke up one morning and wrote Getaway Car, and it just, and then it would all just, no, she's been really systematic about thinking about her career. None of that takes away from the fact that what I guess her genius is that she has met the moment about what it means to be a pop star now, right? To be constantly in dialogue with your fans. That's, I think, her kind of true innovation. The fact that the little breadcrumb trail that she leaves through the songs and who are they about, but she'll never give an interview now, so you never really know, all this numerology stuff that's packed in creates a huge amount of stuff to discuss for the fandom. There's a whole lot of stuff that is around, if the songs were just terrible, you could do all that stuff and it wouldn't matter. But there's way more to the Taylor Swift story than just she's attractive, she's a good singer, she's a good songwriter. There is a methodical approach and an approach in treating people right as well that has actually made her the most success. And I don't know if you've ever worked with people who are really at the top of their game on stuff. It is fascinating how prepped a lot of them are, even the people who make it seem very casual. The level of attention to detail. There was a phrase that David Land, the theatre producer, had, which is, love is paying very close attention. And I think about that a lot. Like when you are writing an article or making a podcast, you could put it out and it'd be 95% good in around time. Or you can work extra hard and make it like 99% as good. And the people who do put that extra bit of work in, you can often really see that.
True. So is this the more like healthy story about success that you want people to move towards, so like we have the genius myth, and you're encouraging people to move away from that towards a more holistic idea of what success means?
Yeah, I think that's really true, because the other thing that happens is when you become very successful and you think it's all about you, is that the burden is huge. And that's when people start taking drugs to deal with the anxiety or whatever it might be, or just being freaked out by the fact that the lifestyle, like suddenly becoming very, very successful is, and this is something that almost nobody wants to talk about, is incredibly difficult, because suddenly you are lifted out from the rank of your peers. I often think that the worst possible thing would be to get famous at 20, because everyone else is going to be
Tell me
like,
about it.
well, yeah, all right, okay, yes. Your circumstances are particularly individual, but there is a kind of, and I'm sure, did you get this kind of thing of like, oh, is she exploiting this terrible thing that happened to her? Actually, secretly, wouldn't everybody want to be famous? Like, even
Oh,
about
I
something
get
as
that
awful as your
all the
experience.
time.
Yeah,
I get
I
that
I
all the
believe
time.
that. Yeah, because there is a kind of, which is a fundamental human jealousy, right? Which is like, other people are looking at that person and not looking at me. Everything in my life would be great. And I think both Elizabeth Gilbert's talked about this in relation to Eat, Pray, Love, and then David Epstein recently about how the success of his book, he had a book range, The Sports Gene, his first book, blew up. It was amazing. And someone said to him very wisely, you're about to be really miserable. Because in our lives, we all carry around this thing where we're like, oh, if I only was, got down to my goal weight, or if I only published a bestseller, or if I only did this or only did that, then I'd be happy. That would be my happy ending. And it's terrible if any of those things actually happen to you, because you realize that your happy ending has happened and you're still you. Like there is no swan. Like, you're still an ugly duckling. You're just now an ugly duckling with a New York Times bestseller. And I thought that was a really like wise and brilliant piece of advice. And so, yeah, there are lots of reflections that come out of this book that about the way that you should approach life and ambition and success. One of which is, find other people who love the things that you love, and make work with them, because it will just be more fun. And when things get really tough, which they inevitably will, you will have a little posse in your corner. And the other thing is, if you look at the careers of people who have great achievements, there are two types of motivation, right? And they're called intrinsic and extrinsic. So intrinsic comes from within you. It is just your personal drive. And the people with that tend to do much better than the people with extrinsic motivation, who are motivated by the fact that they want, the Oscar, they want this award, whatever it is. They want to be a millionaire, because that's just like that. That's a sort of empty milestone. And if you tick it off, you're still you inside. And I don't know how you think about your career now, but now I'm, well into it. I've become much less focused on racking up achievements, and much more on, is my day-to-day life fulfilling? Like, am I doing work that I think is good with people that I think are excellent? And I think that is a much healthier long-term way to think about trying to be successful.
That's so interesting. I mean, y so the way that I've sort of my career trajectory has been uncommon, to say the least, because my entire adult life began with me being buried underneath this horrific story that didn't reflect who I really was. And I felt like, this bomb went off in my life, and my career has been attempting to pick up just the pieces and sort of fit them back together in a way that makes sense in some way. So like it's interesting that you put it that way, because you're right. Like, uh, ideally, the way that you manifest success in your life is this sense of well-being, this sense that whatever you are doing is fulfilling and meaningful, and ideally isn't just fulfilling and meaningful for you, but also for other people. And I think about my poor husband, who um he was a poet and an author, and then as soon as he became my husband, he became my biggest fan. And one of his like deep goals in life is to prove to people that I'm not someone who deserves to be hated, because he loves me, and he is just devastated by how much people continue to this day to just hate me with such a visceral passion. And so he's like internally propelled to like rehabilitate my like place in the world. And in the meantime, I'm very often just feeling like I'm doing the very best with what I have and my own, creative drives, and very often, I'm just flying by the seat of my pants. It doesn't even feel very much like a choice. I just move in the direction that I feel there is momentum, and and do what the best I can with that. And so you catch me at this really interesting moment in my life where I'm having a lot of success very suddenly. Like I just put out a book this year, and I have this Hulu show that just came out. And you're right, like there are people out there who are very like angry about that, like, upset about it. Um and think that I don't deserve it, and that I should just shut up and disappear or whatever, and making all their cultural critiques about it.
But aren't you?
And
But isn't
yeah.
it like the way that your experience overlaps with what I've written about a lot is about kind of the contest of like public life as a contest of storylines or narratives, and being jammed into them. And maybe the only way you can fight one narrative is with another. So I talk in the book about like the kind of great Elon Musk like genius or fraud thing, right? And he is a way of having that argument. And I thought that's why thought it was really interesting that you were working with Monica Lewinsky, because from my younger years, you are two of the most obvious examples I can see of people just being turned into symbols to have a conversation that people wanted to have. Like, and I can't imagine how unbelievably violent that feels to you as the real person at the center of this like crusty carapace of everybody else's expectations and drama and like things that they're working out, and constricting, which is why I think it's really, there is something quite really heartening about the fact that both of you have managed to be your own narrators, right, of your own, rather than being kind of characters in some great cultural storyline.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's exactly it, is both Monica and I refusing to submit to the become like being pigeonholed into these roles to fit some morality narrative that someone else is, trying to say and argue about in this broader way, and just being like, "No, we're just real people over here who have experienced real things." And just, like, trying to just fight to get back to that place of being a person and not a symbol is has been, like, my journey, but in a way that it's led me to be not a normal person, because in order to sort of fight back against this huge, very public narrative, be you have to take up a lot of space and have a very different kind of public narrative. And is that just a losing battle, or is there something valid to that? Um,
I think you
would be
can't
my
debunk a narrative. You can only replace it with a different one. And that's why, that's why I mean, that's why you have Elon Musk genius or fraud, right? Like those are the two competing battles that we're going to have. And they're a proxy for really a left versus right political battle. And so I think, yeah, I don't think it's insane. I think the one thing I would say is that ultimately you have to surrender control about how people feel about you. Like if you have any kind of public life. And I think this is one of the reasons that social media has driven so many people mad, is that it has given them a smaller version of what it's like to be famous and to think about your public face, right? Like that everybody has their personal brand now. And of course, that's always incredibly reductive. And so any person who's been through that, at whatever scale, whether or not it's people being rude about your Instagram or it's a global news story, they just feel like, well, that's not me. That's like only a tiny percentage of me. And I think it just does make everybody feel, yeah, again, dehumanized, which is a word that I do keep coming back to. Because it is about turning people into kind of icons, essentially, or avatars, basically, of larger discussions.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah. So, how do we take, like, if we take away going back to this idea of, like, genius and brilliance, Do you think that we should remove or entirely any idea about any individual's brilliance and instead try to think about them within a context? Or is there value in recognizing that one individual had an insight that other people didn't have?
Oh, definitely think recognizing individual talent and achievement is no bad thing. The way I think about it, though, that's really important distinction to make is the difference between like how many cc's of the engine and like how fast the car can go on the road. And what I mean by that is that I have a chapter on high IQ societies and ultra high IQ societies, and they are full of people who are kind of slightly mystified that despite being the smartest kid in their, every grade at school and whatever it might be, nonetheless they're not Einstein. They're not these globally recognized figures. And that's because, like, as we said before, there's a whole load of other things that are involved in success apart from raw talent or intelligence, not least luck. And so, I think we should celebrate achievement, but not in a kind of sense of an indefinable personal quality, but what you've done with that, right? If you have a brilliant scientific mind and you have used that in order to work on, vaccine research, and now you're one of the team that was involved in like the malaria vaccine, and there are children alive today who wouldn't otherwise be alive because you were brilliant and you had a gift and you used it, that's wonderful. But the bit that I see a bit more in the kind of, I would say, the Silicon Valley tech right, is the idea that if you're just amazing at coding, that's kind of incredible on its own and you don't need to answer for what you've used that talent for. And I guess this is my latent Catholicism coming out in me again, right? But like, have you used your talent to the best of your ability is the question, not how talented are you, really, for me.
Mm-hmm. Mm. What about this idea of platforming or like putting on a pedestal the work or the achievement as opposed to the person? Like how do you do that? And I can see that being a thing that you could do in science, right? Like, oh, we've, a limit, like if someone cured cancer, like great. And of course, by someone, I mean a whole history of people who are attempting to cure cancer. And finally, there's something that cures cancer. So we should celebrate that achievement. That's pretty easy to identify when it comes to something like science or medicine. But what about something that's a little more ephemeral? Like what about a lifetime well lived? Like how do you celebrate and uplift and acknowledge the achievement of just being a person who's had a generally positive vibe in the world? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, David Brooks, the New York Times columnist, has this nice, neat thing which he talks about the difference between resume virtues and eulogy virtues, right? So the kind of things that look really good on your CV versus the kind of things at your funeral that people will say, she was incredibly kind. She always, had time for everybody, whatever it might be. And so I think that's a good way of thinking about it. Like, how good is your eulogy going to be? Because no one's going to stand up at your eulogy and go, and the important thing was that in 6th grade, she got an A for maths. No one cares. Let it go. So I think that's part of it. The harder question, I think, for me is about, and there's a chapter about this, is about the kind of monstrous geniuses, or like particularly in art, where the art is so much obviously a product of a mind, and you don't really like the person whose mind that is. That's really difficult. I mean, the way that I've always thought about it is that you have to have a slightly more grown-up attitude, and that's really difficult. So the way I wrote a piece about when J.K. Rowling first came out as gender critical, and the fact that people were sort of kind of weeping in the streets about how they could never read Harry Potter again. And I compared it, I said, I think the fact that she's a children's author is particularly tough to people because people feel that their childhood is being snatched away from them. But also, I feel like, the people who were writing these things were my age. I'm 41 now. And you're not a child anymore. Your childhood is over. I'm really sorry. You might even have children of your own who are now quite old. And it felt to me very much like this sort of feeling that you have when you're a kid and you suddenly, when you get to teenager and you find that your parents are just normal people, like they do something that's a bit crappy.
Yeah.
And, my parents are pretty amazing, but I definitely don't hero worship them in the same way I did when I was like 7. And that's fine. You come to a more adult, rounded understanding of somebody, and you can love something without liking every single thing about it. You don't have to buy the whole package. And I think that's a really helpful way to look at art, is that you can just love the things about it that you love. It's not like a kind of giant Super Saver deal, but you have to buy absolutely everything. the tricky bit for me, and I don't tell me how you feel about this. I walked out of the MJ, the Michael Jackson musical,
Oh, yeah, okay.
because I just felt like there was the last song before the interval is him complaining about how mean the press are to him, and so they deliberately set the musical, which is very moving on the subject, for example, about how abusive his father was, right, and the racism that he suffered, genuine torments in his life. But it's deliberately set the year before the child abuse accusations came out, so they can just sort of never mention this didn't happen.
Ah,
And I just,
right.
as a journalist, I was like, I don't the bit when they're like, oh, aren't the media beastly to him? It's like, okay, but
But
I,
he's not above criticism. Yeah, yeah,
yeah, but
exactly.
like if
Yeah.
if I was having kids over to my house for sleepovers with Bubbles the chimp, I'd expect to face a few tough questions as well. So this is like special pleading. And then I just also thought about it like this has been done so cynically in order because we know there's a market for a jukebox musical of Michael Jackson songs because people still love Beat It and Billie Jean. But they're going to feel really awkward about all of that. So let's just find a way just to sweep that all under the table so it doesn't get in the way of anyone's enjoyment. And that was the point where I was just like, I don't want to be part of this enterprise. And I thought, am I just being a massive hypocrite because I'm normally like, separate the art and the artist? And I just thought, well, I don't know. Tell me, am I being a massive hypocrite? Like, we can have the Knox judgment on
Well,
this one.
yeah, actually, the Knox judgment, as if I'm the judge of all
You can
things. But
bang your
honestly,
gavel.
what you
Yeah.
no, actually reminds me of this really funny thing that my friend Whitney Cummings said recently about God, what's his face? Blah, blah, he was found guilty of raping women by giving them sedatives, and then Bill Cosby. Oh my God, because I'm so young that I forget the name Bill Cosby. But she was joking about like she also is a separate the art from the artist kind of person, but she says that she can't watch Bill Cosby's old TV show because specifically he's a gynecologist. Like his character in the show is he's a gynecologist who is like doing exams of women in his basement and then like coming up and like taking off his gloves and setting them on the kitchen table, and she's just like if it's like his comedy and his personality is and the art that he is making is not removed enough from the actual crimes that he committed. And so I think that you're pinpointing something which is true, which is, you know, any given Michael Jackson song like Billie Jean or whatever, like has nothing to do with him and his misdoings with young children in his property. But if there is a piece of art that is explicitly trying to uh do away with or like it's explicitly about his life, and then it is making a commentary about a certain thing that is happening in his life and trying to just like downplay it or like spin it in a way that is not adhering to reality, like I can see where you would feel like deeply annoyed by that.
Yeah, Claire Dederer
And I
says
feel
that in
that.
her essay, which she turned into a book about, in her case, about the films of Woody Allen. In which there is a kind of guy who's dating a much younger woman, and everybody's absolutely fine with it, and just being like, oh, hang on a minute, I'm kind of being asked to go along with this. And I think comedy often presents the hardest version of this because the way I think of it is that laughter is complicity. Right. So it's not just, you dancing to Billie Jean is not a kind of ideological statement, but you deciding to find something funny and laughing together in a group with people and all giving the comedian the feedback that there is permission to do more of that is a kind of sign off on whatever is being said. And I think it's why some of the biggest arguments we have about kind of cancellation, things like that, do end up revolving around comedy, because you are being asked to kind of go along with something by laughing at it.
Yeah. Yeah, there's this saying in Italian, scherzando, scherzando si dice la verità. So jokingly, jokingly, you tell the truth. So the idea is at the heart of every joke, you are saying something true, and that's why it is resonating with people, and that's why they're laughing. And so if people are laughing at something that is problematic, then it's suggestive of, again, like you're saying, that it's consenting to or going along with whatever is being said. Um, That's
Yeah, there's a really
interesting.
brilliant Trevor Griffiths play called The Comedians, which is exactly about this. It's about a group of like club comedians in the 70s when everyone would have been doing like mother-in-law jokes and Pakistani jokes and stuff like that, and about the kind of resistance to that. And I have a huge amount of respect for that generation of alternative comedians that came in and did things that were surreal or just, completely off the wall because they were reacting against the previous generation above them's kind of reactionary nature of their comedy. But you're right, is that there is also fundamentally people do want to have taboos prodded. Like I was a journalist throughout the kind of peak cancellation era. And unless you live in a truly totalitarian society, unless it's like China and your internet access is genuinely being restricted, the more you kind of suppress certain conversations, the more people are convinced that there must be a reason that they won't let you have them. And I think that those efforts were often a lot less successful at driving bad discourse out of the public arena than perhaps the people who advocated for that hoped.
So back to the idea of geniuses, do you think there are any cases whatsoever where difficult personalities, like or even abusive personalities, are necessary to push boundaries, or is that always a cop out? Because like I also think that for people to be successful and innovative, again, you don't that doesn't just happen in a vacuum. And so it almost seems to me like innovation comes like in spite of instead of because of the difficult personality. But what is your take on that?
Yeah, there's a very famous quote from Steve Wozniak about working with Steve Jobs, which is in the Walter Isaacson biography, in which he says, if I'd run Apple, it would have been like a much nicer place to work, but we would never have made the iMac. And his idea was that Steve Jobs was kind of difficult and obsessive and demanding and odd in lots of ways, but he was also a visionary who drove people. And I think there's something to that. However, I have a sneaking suspicion that it's the other way round. In that, I think what actually happens is sometimes if people are odd or difficult and demanding, they create a kind of cult around themselves and a kind of Stockholm syndrome for people who think, well, why am I putting up with this? Oh, it must be because I'm in the presence of greatness. And I think one of the things that really worries me is not that so much that you need kind of assholes in order to get stuff done, but more that nice people who are genuinely inspirational get underrated because our cultural template of the genius is that kind of difficult, demanding jerk. And so, I do wonder if that's the way in which the template of the genius is actually kind of goes the other way around, right? It's not about pure objective achievements. It's about a certain type of behavior that then makes you more likely than someone else who's equally talented, but more quote unquote normal, to be called a genius. So I know what you mean, though. There is a horror. It is. I do wrestle with it because I don't know the answer to it about whether or not have we developed some of these tropes about genius in order as a kind of cultural antibody to dealing with jerks, basically, to be able to kind of excuse them. I also think there's something about the fact that, again, it comes back to hero worship, that there's a brilliant word that I learned from the anthropologist Manveer Singh, his book on shamans, when he talks about the fact that shamans in traditional culture often make themselves odd. They wear the bird head, they have tattoos, they fast, they live outside the village, whatever it might be. And the word he uses for it is xenized with an X, like they make themselves foreign, essentially. And I think there's something about when people are special, we want them to be weird. We hoover up all the stories, and maybe those stories get embellished over time. How many times have you heard the kind of Silicon Valley story of like, oh, he only sleeps 4 hours a night, or he read Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy when he was 18 months old, or like, whatever it might be. Like the actual facts of the life are kind of just dredged up and kind of polished up. To the extent that when you get the occasional kind of fraudster comes along, they will often have all exactly the same kind of anecdotes. It's just now that we understood that they've kind of done that quite cynically. So a very obvious example is Elizabeth Holmes of Theranos, the blood testing company that turned out to be built entirely on lies. She turned herself into a mini Steve Jobs with the roll neck and the deep voice and the dramatizing, because that's what people expected an inventor, an innovator to look like. Or Sam Bankman-Fried, according to Michael Lewis's biography, he used to like deliberately mess up his hair and drop crisps all over himself because that's what people wanted to see. They wanted to see this 21-year-old kid who's an amazing coder. He's going to disrupt the financial system. And if some little spod comes in a suit and just like lays out his PowerPoint presentation, everyone's going to be disappointed. What they want is to have some sort of wild idiot savant come in who's like, he's so busy thinking about, you know, calculus that he can't brush his hair. This is what geniuses are like. You know, they want an encounter with the kind of special and transcendental. And unfortunately, that means that, you know, con men can basically jam that signal by, you know, we had a prime minister here in Britain, Boris Johnson, who deliberately would also, like, he had big blonde hair and he would just like mess it up and be like, oh, cripes, don't, whatever. And it was just like this big act that he put on because he knew that people loved it. He knew that tapped into the kind of scatterbrained, and then he would sort of quote stuff in Latin, you know, that this was a kind of idea of what genius was, that, ooh, you speak Latin and you can't be bothered to brush your hair. You must be having really big thoughts.
Right, right. That reminds me of an episode. Have you ever seen the show Community?
I've heard of it, but I haven't really seen it.
Oh my God, it's one of the best sitcoms ever. But there's this episode where one of the characters gets mustard on her face from eating a sandwich, and suddenly, because she has mustard on her face, everyone starts listening to her, and she becomes this huge figure, and suddenly she's the hero of everybody, like telling them how it is, the working class man. She basically becomes like the Malcolm X of her like community college because she has mustard on her face, and as soon as she like wipes it off, everyone is like done with her. And it just seems very similar.
The tragic thing is I don't think it works for women, right? Like I read Latin, I did Latin A-level, turns out no one cares. Literally no one cares.
So why is that? Why is it that we are prone? What I have found is that we are prone to wanting to find fault in women who happen to be elevated in some kind of way. But even like the faults of the men, like even in that fault finding of men, it doesn't deplatform them. It doesn't depedestal them. Why is that? What is going on there?
It's a really deep question. I've been thinking about it a lot. And I think a lot of it is about kind of hierarchies. I think there are some men, and by no means all, who find the idea of like having a female boss or looking up to a woman sort of odd and emasculating. You know, there are some men who I think, you know, have female friends, are really happy in female company. You know, my husband is one of those, right? He is, you know, he's incredibly happy to be the only man in a group of women. Like, he doesn't find this alarming at all. At the same time, he like runs ultra marathons and does other kind of, you know, other kind of solitary masculine pursuits. But there are some guys who I think just are, the way the technical term for it is homosocial, right? All of their bonds are men. And actually, having spent a lot of time studying that Joe Rogan kind of podcast scene, if you want like podcasts, if you want to see men who only really like talking to other men, like have a dip into podcasts on YouTube, because there is a whole kind of bloviating circle of life about men who just go on each other's podcasts and share their opinions with each other. And they don't, you know, I can't really imagine that any of them listening rapt in attention for 3 hours to even the most expert woman in the world, right? They just don't seem to process the idea that women can be experts in anything, or that they would ever look up to a woman. And I think that must be a big part of it. You know, men don't read books by women. I mean, men don't. This is my Helen's wild generalizations half hour, but we know that there's a reading crisis. It's particularly acute among men. They, you know, and they're
listening to podcasts.
Well, yes, unfortunately, they're listening to other men on podcasts. But this is particularly acute with female authors, right? There's a reason that J.K. Rowling didn't use her full name when she first published those books. There's a reason that back in the day George Eliot didn't either. Like, there is a issue, and I definitely found this when I was writing this book. It was really interesting. I had a couple of incredibly snooty reviews by men in which I felt that the general tone was kind of like, "Shut up, silly little girl." And you're like, okay, actually, I thank you. I'm actually bordering on old crone now, if you don't mind. But like, I've passed out of the silly little girl and I'm now in the silly old bat era. But that was just really fascinating to me. They were sort of full of this like lofty disdain. And I just think, that I don't know about you, but I always feel very nitpicked Like whenever I write something, I'll publish it, I find that people are just looking to nitpick, and you can't get away with any kind of grand sweeping assertions. And then I read stuff by kind of male peers, and I'm like, is that actually like, is there evidence for that? But they, these kind of grand sweeping declarative assertions that creep their way into them, and they just seem to get away with it. So I do sometimes feel that you are playing on a slightly higher difficulty setting as a woman in some of these arenas.
And yet, there's Taylor Swift. Is she just the exception that proves the rule? There's Beyonce, like
Yeah,
what
I know. You're right. It's a good challenge because pop music is fascinating at the moment, which in that it's dominated by single female acts, right? When I grew up, it was like the 90s, it was Britpop, it was all men with guitars. And now the biggest selling artists are women. But that's also kind of interesting to me about whether or not pop has got the same cultural significance it had when it was much more male dominated. So there's been a lot of chatter about like the death of the literary novel and like, why don't young men get published in the New Yorker anymore? And the really tragic thing about that is that I would say that it's become devalued at the exact same time that it's become incredibly female dominated, which is something that we see happen across all kinds of industries. There's a reason why you will see coding and STEM subjects held up as being the only real, proper, true academic subjects rather than the humanities, which have now got a bit flaky. And it's a very gendered one, right? When in the 18th century, when men were poets and women were writing novels, poetry was much more prestigious than the novel writing was. So I think there's also that. But it now seems slightly ludicrous, but Taylor Swift has all the way through her career faced these sort of accusations that she's not. The music's so shallow. It's only listened to by girls. The same reason that people hated the Beatles when they first came out, right? The Beatles were just this pop band that young women wet themselves about. And then a generation of like male rock critics discovered them and went, oh, actually, this stuff's musically quite complex. I don't know why anyone didn't notice this before we came along. So yeah, I don't know. You can end up making very sweeping generalizations about gender. That's the problem. But I do think there is something about the fact that we imbue men with much more authority, unearned authority sometimes, whereas women have to kind of scrabble for it a lot more.
So can we get back to the subject of the story and how the story is so important for understanding or how we elevate the person? Because I am interested in how we can feel trapped in stories. That's something that I've experienced in my life, and I do know there's a great researcher who has explored this idea of narrative foreclosure. This idea that in your own life, your ability to be the protagonist of your own life is sort of taken away from you. Other people are really authoring what your life is all about. And in a way, that is even something that the genius might be experiencing. Like you said, if you are successful, suddenly there's a narrative that is being written around you by society that says, oh, here you go. You are now a genius and you better continue being a genius or you're just a one-hit wonder. Like, oh, also, can we talk about one-hit wonders and how that plays into this whole genius myth? And because there's also that, right? Like there are those who there's this expectation that if you're a genius, you need to be putting out genius things forever and ever and ever. And if you're not, then you're not really a genius. You're something else. So do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think, one of my favorite stories in the book is William Shockley, who was a mid 20th century American chemist, physicist. Let me think which way around it is. But anyway, he won the Nobel Prize, I think, in 1958 for his role in the invention of the transistor. And he is fascinating because he was a medium smart kid. As it turns out, there's another story in the book about Lewis Terman, this great social scientist who recruited a load of kids because he thought, he wanted to study future geniuses. And William Shockley was tested to be as a potential entrant to this program and failed. His IQ wasn't high enough. So he was medium smart, but not like marked for greatness from the beginning. But he went to Stanford at exactly the right time, the time it was the most exciting place to be in the world for physics research. And he was there for the dawn of the electronic age. But what happened to him after he won the Nobel It's fascinating, and there is a phrase called Nobelitis because this does happen to, unfortunately, too many of them, which is that he just thought he was a universal, all-round, special, smart person. He didn't think, oh, I worked really hard in my domain and I understand that, and we had a lucky break, and my lab was brilliant. He thought, no, I'm brilliant. It's me. But nothing else ever worked out for him as well as that, right? He got obsessed with IQ and race, always a bad sign. And he got obsessed with psychometric testing. He started subjecting his employees to like all these IQ and personality tests. Eventually, they all walked out of Shockley Semiconductor, his firm. Basically the foundation of Silicon Valley is the story of people who were pissed off at their boss being William Shockley and leaving and going and doing something else. And so he just systematically torched his entire legacy by constantly talking about race and IQ. And it was a fascinating story to me because this is playing out in like the 70s, but it feels so unbelievably modern, right? I'm sure you can think of examples of people who had one brilliant success, undeniable, and then have just gone cuckoo and just set about like burning everything to the ground. And it's, and I think it is a kind of classic genius myth, which is just the sort of feeling that you should be listened to now, and you should be listened to on everything because you're part of a superior class person. And then when you get any kind of pushback, you try and explain yourself and hedge it a bit, but then actually you're now getting loads of attention of the type that you used to get for your positive career, but now it might be negative, but at least people are listening to you, so you're important, you matter, and so you get further and further down that path of saying cuckoo things. And I think that is a kind of, that's not quite a one-hit wonder, but it is a bit about what do you do past your creative peak, which is not something that's really been studied a lot. And and people don't really talk about publicly. But once you've had your big success, what does then the rest of a fulfilling career look like? Or do you just go bonkers and start airing your thoughts about, astrology or whatever it might be?
Yeah.
Like, you're usually, I found a really odd recurrent strain of people going slightly bonkers in the book and deciding that they'd come up with a new theoretical model of the universe. And like, that happens a lot to people who don't have a physics degree. Now, it's possible that someone from completely outside mainstream academia will overturn Einstein's theory of general relativity. I'm not going to say it's not going to happen. I'm just saying, if you do think
ambitious.
that you've probably just, like now particularly, Travis Kalanick of Uber said that he started, like, he felt like he was doing really good explorations at the edge of physics now just by talking to ChatGPT. And I would just say, if that happens to you, your first thought shouldn't be, probably they're going to give me the Nobel Prize for this. Your first thought should probably be, oh no, have I gone mad? I think I might have gone mad.
I wonder if do you have any thoughts about whether there are interesting parallels with, so typically I'm not talking with people who are at creative peaks in their life. I'm talking to people who are at, tragic lows of their life. And I wonder if there's any interesting parallels with how we recover from these peaks and valleys. And how do you, like, what are the ways that one can avoid going down the madness path? Because I also think that one track from a deep, deep valley is losing your mind and becoming like really bitter or conspiratorial or just like hyper obsessed or even just um uh, like narcissistic in a deeply negative way where you blame yourself for everything in the way that a genius would praise himself for everything. What are the best paths forward to recover from these moments of peaks and valleys that we inevitably all have in life? Like, we're not all going to invent something and get a Nobel Prize, but we're going to have achievements. How do we like recover from the achievement in a way that like grounds us and allows us to continue, like, to like ride the wave of that achievement without, burning that legacy down?
You're right. There is a real problem when something terrible happens to somebody and they spend the rest of their life as if they will at some point be a kind of, the universe will apologize to them. And I think particularly when things have happened to people that are unjust or unfair, that can be all, I mean, you would know this better than anybody, that can be all consuming, right? The idea that if you could just get whatever it might be. And the same thing I think happens with grief as well. Like there is a stage of grief where you just don't want to accept that it's happened, and you sort of, there's like a bargaining stage of it, where you just feel like you get a rerun. And like so they'll be like chase something, and then eventually hopefully you realize that like no, this is just a new reality now, and you won't ever get, the universe does not deliver apologies. One of the things I found really useful to find out, like this is why I love doing history, because history tells you, history and literature tell you that these things have happened to innumerable other people before you. But in Difficult Women, the history of the suffragettes is really fascinating. In Britain, women got the vote towards the end of the Second World War in 1918. And the suffragettes, who had given so much, you know, devoted the best years of their life to this cause. Some of them had been in prison, some of them in force-fed, which we now see as torture, you know, all these terrible things. They've been persecuted by the British state, surveilled. Almost none of them did anything in politics. You know, Emmeline Pankhurst, who was really the suffragette leader, ran as a conservative, minor conservative member of parliament, a lawmaker. But they were just kind of burned out. And none of the people who'd oppose them, one of them being Winston Churchill, ever really turned around and went, oh, you know what, we really called that wrong, didn't we? Sorry about that. They never got their apology. And actually, what happened was that the immensity of their struggle began to be downgraded almost the minute that they'd won, which was the kind of this idea they were sort of pushing on an open door, and no one really would have been against that. And I just thought, well, that's a really useful lesson, that actually, again, to come back to this idea, that winning will never feel great, because the most you can really hope for is that people will, you know, pretend that they were on your side all along, or that you were making kind of common sense arguments, and it wasn't that big a deal, because that's psychologically a lot easier for people than admitting that they were wrong. So I think that thing is just accepting that there is no press conference. No one ever holds a press conference to apologize to you and tell you that you were right, and you're just gonna have to make your peace with that. But also the other thing that I think is worth remembering is that for most people there is post-traumatic growth. That actually, if you talk to people who've been through something really horrible, they often will talk about it as not exactly an enriching experience, but one that has made them stronger, because they know if they can survive that, they can survive anything. And I do think that is something that's kind of worth hanging on to. And again, I also think everything kind of really, all my advice about life, which I can't take myself, comes down to think about yourself a bit less. Right? And I think that's, you know, that's true. I just, it's quite helpful to try and focus on the fact that you are not the center of the universe, and that you can still be helpful to other people, and that you should try and think about other people and not so much about yourself. I think that's just kind of quite freeing, really.
Well, awesome. Where can people find you and find your work, Helen?
They can find me at The Atlantic, where I'm a staff writer. They can find the book in every online bookshop that they like, whether in the UK or the US. And I have a Substack, because that's the law. Everyone
yes,
has to.
It is the law.
It's just mandated now. You've got to do it.
All right. Thank you so much, Helen. It's been great.